6 trucks, branded in bright green and gold, roared up the dusty, vine-lined path toward the gates of Ruby Hill Vineyard. The rubber of their tires screeched against the gravel as they slammed to a halt. My heart kicked into overdrive, a feeling I hadn't had since the last all-nighter at the tech startup I used to run. I set down the pruning shears I'd been using to trim the edges of my Cabernet vines and squinted at the convo. What the hell? Then they spilled out. 6 men, all in matching yellow vests and hard hats, each holding a clipboard like it was a badge of honor. Without a word, they fanned out, like they owned the place. One of them, taller, wearing sunglasses even though the sun was barely up, marches toward me with purpose. He didn't even wave or acknowledge the morning breeze or the ripe clusters of grapes hanging heavy on the vine. He pointed straight at the old stone wine cellar door. "Cut the lock," he commanded, the words sharp as broken glass. I stood frozen, heart hammering in my chest. My vineyard, my dream, the $600,000 I poured into restoring this crumbling patch of land, and they were here to destroy it? Before I could open my mouth, another man with a bolt cutter was already making quick work of the rusted lock, snapping it like it was twine. This isn't happening. This can't be real. "Hey!" I shouted, rushing toward them. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The tall man with the sunglasses barely turned to acknowledge me. "Sir," he said with a smug grin, "we're here to enforce HOA rules. You'll need to come with us to the office and get registered under the Emerald Crest HOA, immediately. You owe $6,200 in back dues and—" "Back dues?" I repeated, my blood boiling. "I'm not even part of your damn HOA. I've got the deed right here that says this land isn't under your jurisdiction. I don't owe you a cent." His smile didn't waver. "Not anymore. The board recently voted to extend their reach, and your property now falls within our boundaries. You'll have to comply with all the regulations, effective immediately. If you don't, we'll have no choice but to initiate compliance demolition." "Compliance demolition?" I spat, my fists clenched. "You think you can just waltz onto my land and tear down my hard work?" One of the men with a clipboard nodded toward the vineyards. "We've already marked some violations. The trellis is out of code. This whole area's not up to standards. We'll start with a fine for unauthorized cultivation." I stared at the neatly trimmed rows, the carefully nurtured vines that took months to restore, and my gut twisted in disbelief. They couldn't be serious. "This land is my life's work. I've spent every penny I've got, my savings, my sweat, restoring it. You can't just come in and steal it from me because you decided to expand your HOA. Get off my property, or I'll call the sheriff." The tall man, unfazed, motioned to one of his crew. "Start taking photos of the violations, and prepare the notice of enforcement." But before I could react, my phone buzzed. A text from Mara Ortiz, the local reporter who'd covered some of the vineyard's restoration story. "Heads up. Someone just tipped me off that Emerald Crest HOA is trying to claim your land. What's going on?" I looked up at the clipboard enforcers, who were now snapping photos of my grapevines, the barn, and the main house. One of them even aimed his camera at my front door, where I had hung a homemade sign that said, "Private property. No HOA." I quickly typed back, "They're here now. They say I have to join their HOA, or they're demolishing my vines. They've already cut my lock." I didn't wait for a reply. I turned toward the men, trying to steady my breathing. "Listen, I've worked too damn hard for this vineyard for you to waltz in here and take it. You need to leave, now. I'll call the sheriff and have you all arrested for trespassing and property damage." The tall man stepped forward, his tone condescending. "You'll be hearing from our legal department, Mr. Hayes. But trust me, this is just the beginning. You should have read the fine print before buying land near Emerald Crest Estates." I could feel the ground beneath me shift, the weight of 1,000 decisions I'd made crashing down on me. But I wasn't backing down, not this time. Not when everything I worked for was on the line. I squared my shoulders. "Get off my land. Or else." He smirked one last time, then gestured to his crew to pack up. You'll regret this, Mr. Hayes. You'll see. As the convoy drove off, I stood in the growing heat of the morning, heart still racing. I couldn't let them get away with this. This wasn't just a land grab, it was extortion. And I'd be damned if I let them ruin everything I'd worked for. But what I didn't know yet was how deep the HOA's claws ran, and how far they would go to take what wasn't theirs. The next few hours felt like a bad dream. I couldn't focus, couldn't think straight. After the convoy of HOA trucks drove off, I stood in the vineyard, my mind racing. What just happened? I pulled out my phone and called Jillian, my cousin, who was more of a bulldog lawyer than a family member. She had helped me navigate the initial purchase of the land and had been the one person I trusted to keep me from making rash decisions. When she picked up, I didn't even bother with pleasantries. Jill, you won't believe this. The HOA just raided my land, demanded I join or they'd bulldoze my vines. I've got the deed, I've got the right to this land, and they're claiming it's now theirs. What do I do? She was quiet for a beat, then replied, All right, calm down. First, send me all the documents, and let me see this alleged annexation map they showed you. If they're trying to extend their boundaries illegally, we'll shut this down before they even get started. But we need proof they're overstepping. I sent her every file, email, and photo I had, everything from the deed, the annexation map they showed me, and even the photos of their so-called violations they snapped on their way out. The longer I stared at those photos, the more ridiculous it all seemed. My vineyard was pristine. Every vine was nurtured, every inch of land cared for like it was my own child. I didn't have time to wait for Jillian's response, though. I knew the only way to stop them now was to get ahead of them, show the community what was going on, and build an army of support before they could twist the narrative. So, I pulled out my phone and sent a quick message to Mara Ortiz, the local reporter I knew would have my back. HOA just raided my land. They say I have to join or they'll destroy my vineyard. I've got all the documentation proving they have no jurisdiction, but I need this on the news. She texted back almost immediately. I'm on it. I'll bring the camera crew over this afternoon. By the time the camera crew arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the vineyard. I showed Mara and her crew around, explaining what had happened, how the HOA had cut the lock on my cellar door and snapped photos of my land in an attempt to create violations. I told them about the bogus annexation map they had shown me and how they demanded I sign their rules, or else they would tear down my vines. Mara asked if I had any formal legal backing yet, and I shook my head. I'm waiting for my cousin to get back to me. But the problem is, they're already taking action. If I don't fight back now, I lose everything. The camera crew filmed while I stood among the vines, trying to hold my anger in check. This vineyard is my life, I thought. I won't let them take it. When the news segment aired that evening, it was everything I had hoped for and more. Mara had done an incredible job. The story was front and center in the local news. Local vineyard owner accuses HOA of extortion, says they're trying to bulldoze his business. They played footage of the HOA trucks arriving, the bolt cutters, and the photo of the bogus annexation map. Mara's voiceover narrated my story, how I invested my life savings into restoring this land, only for the HOA to swoop in and demand that I join their community, or face the destruction of everything I had built. The story gained traction quickly. Within hours, people in the area were sending messages of support, and social media started buzzing with the hashtag #SaveRubyHillVineyard. Local farmers, vintners, and business owners reached out to offer help, whether it was legal assistance, materials for repairs, or just moral support. But as much as the support felt good, I knew the HOA wasn't going to back down just because of a news segment. The real fight was just beginning, and they weren't going to let go of their land grab without a fight. I stared at the TV as the segment ended, and my phone buzzed with another text. Jillian. Got the documents. They're bluffing, but they're going to make it ugly. I'll be there first thing tomorrow morning. We're taking this to court if we have to, but you need to be prepared for a full-blown war. I took a deep breath. A war. I'm ready for it. Ruby Hill Vineyard wasn't just a piece of land to me, it was everything. And I wasn't about to let anyone take it without a fight. As the days dragged on, the weight of what was happening really began to sink in. This vineyard wasn't just a business, it was a dream that I'd spent my entire adult life building up to. I had spent $600,000 of my life savings on this forgotten piece of land, every penny I had, everything I'd saved over the years as a software engineer. My heart and soul were buried in every vine, every row, and every brick of the stone wine cellar I painstakingly restored. I knew how to code software, but nothing could have prepared me for the complexity of nurturing a vineyard and making it thrive. Flashbacks to the first time I laid eyes on Ruby Hill Vineyard are like scenes from a movie. The day I bought the land was one of the best days of my life. I just sold a portion of my equity from my tech startup, and after the deal closed, I had one thought in mind: it was time for a change. No more office work, no more constant pressure. I needed space, silence, and purpose. The vineyard was everything I dreamed about and more. It was run down, tangled grapevines, broken fencing, a crumbling barn. The previous owner had let it go to seed, but I saw potential. I saw history in the soil and possibility in the rows of grapevines waiting to be brought back to life. The first time I walked through the fields, the air was thick with the scent of wildflowers, and the view from the hillside was breathtaking. I imagined what it could be, how the vines would look in bloom, the cellar filled with barrels of wine aging in the cool dark. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, my opportunity to create something from scratch. So, I did what any person chasing a dream would do. I poured every dollar I had into it. New irrigation, organic compost, top-grade grapevines from France, a completely renovated winery. Over the next year, I slowly turned it into a working vineyard again. I hired local workers to rebuild the structures, planted new vines with a carefully selected blend, and turned the old farmhouse into a welcoming tasting room. I worked late into the night, cleaned the old press, and made the wine. There were setbacks. Some vines didn't take, the soil had to be treated, but little by little, the vineyard began to thrive. It was slow, but it was happening. The first harvest was the most exciting day of my life. Those first clusters of grapes, ripe, deep purple, full of life, were a sign that the long hours had been worth it. I bottled the first batch of wine and poured a glass for myself. I toasted to the future, to the dream I'd created with my own hands. And now, the HOA wanted to come in and tear it all down. They wanted to strip away my success, my dream, and force me into a mold I had no interest in being part of. They wanted to impose their regulations and claim control of a piece of land I had worked my whole life for. But I couldn't let that happen. I knew deep down that this vineyard wasn't just about the wine. It wasn't even just about the land, it was about everything I had built. This was my home now. My roots were deep in the soil. I had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let anyone take it away. So, I resolved to fight. Not just for the land, but for the life I had created here. Ruby Hill Vineyard wasn't just a vineyard, it was my legacy, my new life. And I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me without a fight. The next morning, after Mara's news segment aired and the local buzz picked up speed, I knew I had to act fast. The HOA was moving quickly, way too quickly for someone who just claimed they had a right to my land. I needed to build my defense. Jillian arrived in the late morning, armed with her usual no-nonsense attitude. I handed her the stack of documents I'd collected, the deed to the property, the supposed annexation map the HOA had shown me, all the violation photos they'd taken of my vineyard. Jillian skimmed through them, her eyes flicking from one paper to the next. "I don't see anything official here," she said, frowning as she flipped through the annexation map. "This map isn't even filed with the county. Hell, there's not even a county stamp on it. It looks like a high school project." I nodded, frustration boiling. "That's what they handed me. But they swear the vineyard's now part of their HOA. They're threatening to demolish my vineyard if I don't pay their fines and join their rules." Jillian leaned back in her chair, her expression hardening. "They can't just claim land based on a map with no legal backing. They can't even enforce their rules unless it's in writing and approved by the county. And that, she slammed the deed down on the table, is your golden ticket. I blinked, confused. What do you mean? Look at the deed again, she said, pulling it toward her. She pointed at the top line, where the property description was. There's no mention of any HOA covenants, nothing that ties your property to Emerald Crest Estates or any HOA, for that matter. And that means they have no claim here. Not unless they can prove they filed an official annexation, which, as we both know, they haven't. I stared at the document, trying to absorb it. Jillian was right. My deed had no mention of the HOA. It was my land, purchased legally and free of any encumbrances. They had nothing to stand on. They had no legal right to dictate how I used my property. Jillian continued, You'll need to send a letter to their board, along with a copy of your deed and the annexation map, demanding they cease and desist. And if they don't stop, which they won't, we'll file a lawsuit. We'll drag them through the legal system until they realize they're wasting everyone's time. The thought of dragging this into court was daunting. I had no desire to get bogged down in a legal battle, especially one that could take months, but I wasn't going to back down now. Not after everything I'd invested. Do you think it'll be enough? I asked, my voice tight with determination. Absolutely. They've overstepped their bounds, and we've got the evidence to prove it. Once we hit them with the legal facts, along with the media coverage, it'll back them into a corner. They won't have a choice but to back off. Jillian smiled, a rare grin that showed her teeth. But don't expect them to go quietly. If they had any legal legs to stand on, they wouldn't be pulling these kinds of stunts. And it sounds like they're desperate. I nodded, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. I had the law on my side, but the HOA would fight back hard. I wasn't sure what other dirty tricks they had up their sleeves, but I was prepared to outlast them. Let's get started, I said, determination settling in my chest like a heavy stone. Jillian immediately pulled out her laptop and began drafting the letter to the HOA, outlining their complete lack of legal standing and demanding that they stop interfering with my vineyard. It wasn't just a letter, it was a warning. As Jillian worked, I felt a flicker of hope rise in me. This was my home, my future, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it. No matter how hard they pushed, I would push harder. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. By the end of the day, Jillian had finished drafting the cease and desist letter, and we were ready to send it off to the HOA's board. We made sure to include the deed, the evidence of their fraudulent annexation map, and a stern warning: if they continued with this illegal harassment, we'd take them to court. But I knew that wouldn't be enough to make them back off. They had already proven they were willing to use underhanded tactics, and this was about to escalate in ways I hadn't anticipated. That night, after the sun had dipped behind the hills and the vineyard was bathed in the soft orange glow of the sunset, I sat on the porch, nursing a glass of wine from the first batch I'd ever made. It should have been a celebratory moment, but my mind was too preoccupied with the looming battle. As I stared into the glass, trying to calm my thoughts, my phone buzzed with an incoming message from Mara Ortiz. You won't believe this, but the HOA just posted an updated annexation map. It includes your vineyard, and they're claiming they've legally expanded their boundaries to include everything within a 5-mile radius of the original development. I'm sending you a copy. They're getting desperate. My heart skipped. 5 miles? I opened the file she sent, and there it was. The new map. A phantom map, more like it. The HOA had added new lines, encircling all the land near the original Emerald Crest Estates. But there was no county stamp, no official filing, no legal record of any vote that could have approved such a thing. It was, quite literally, a fabricated document. I stared at the map, feeling a knot tighten in my chest. The boundaries they had drawn extended all the way to my vineyard. They were claiming to have annexed my land under the false pretense of a community expansion. This wasn't just a legal battle now. This was a fight for my home, my livelihood, and I wasn't going to let them erase everything I'd built. I immediately texted Mara back. Send it to the media. Every local outlet. We need to expose them. And get that map in front of the county zoning committee. This is beyond just an HOA trying to bully a property owner. They're committing fraud. Mara was quick to respond. Already on it. I'll make sure the zoning board sees it, and the news will cover it tomorrow. We've got this. I spent the rest of the evening making phone calls, local reporters, legal experts, anyone who could help get the word out. I wasn't going to let the HOA use this fake map as a weapon to control my property. The next morning, the story broke. HOA caught falsifying annexation maps to seize property, including Ruby Hill Vineyard, flashed across every local news channel. Mara had worked fast, and soon, my vineyard was the center of a growing media storm. As expected, the HOA denied everything, but their lies were crumbling under the pressure. The fake annexation map was exposed for what it was, a last-ditch effort to intimidate me into submission. But now the tide was turning. The community began rallying behind me. Local farmers, wine producers, and even businesses that didn't have a direct stake in the vineyard started to speak out, condemning the HOA's tactics. Social media flooded with posts of support. #SaveRubyHillVineyard was trending within hours, and phone lines to the county zoning office lit up with complaints. By the time Jillian and I were ready to meet with the county zoning board, the pressure on the HOA was unbearable. The county had already opened an investigation into the annexation map and the fraud behind it. We weren't just fighting the HOA anymore. We were fighting for transparency, accountability, and fairness in property rights. It wasn't just about Ruby Hill Vineyard anymore. It was about sending a message to every HOA that thought it could bully property owners into submission. As Jillian and I prepared for the next round of legal battles, one thing was clear: this fight was far from over. And now, with the community behind us and the county's attention, we had a chance to win, not just for me, but for every landowner who feared being steamrolled by a powerful HOA. This wasn't just about vines. This was about standing up for what was right. The media storm raged on for days, with reporters calling me constantly, asking for updates, and showing up at the vineyard to film. It felt like the world was finally on my side. But as much as I appreciated the support, I knew the HOA wouldn't just roll over and surrender. They'd escalate. They always escalate. That night, as I walked through the vineyard to check on the irrigation system, something didn't feel right. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the faint hum of the wind in the vines. I stopped at the old pump house, where I'd installed new filters and upgraded the system to ensure water flowed freely to the rows of grapes. But as I approached, my stomach twisted. The small building where the pump was housed had been tampered with. The door was ajar, and the lock on the outside had been sliced clean through. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the dimness. What I saw sent a chill down my spine. The new filtration system, my filtration system, was in pieces. The pipes that connected to the main irrigation lines had been ripped out, and the newly installed water filters were shattered, lying in pieces on the concrete floor. A quick glance at the tank showed that it had been drained, completely. Someone had deliberately cut off the water supply to the vineyard. My first thought was of the vines. Thousands of dollars in crops that relied on that system to survive. But there was no time to waste on panic. This was sabotage, plain and simple. Someone wanted to hurt my livelihood, and they'd gone to great lengths to do it. I pulled out my phone, dialing Jillian. "I need you here. They've hit the irrigation system. Someone's sabotaging my farm." My first thought was of the vines. Thousands of dollars in crops that relied on that system to survive. But there was no time to waste on panic. This was sabotage, plain and simple. Someone wanted to hurt my livelihood, and they'd gone to great lengths to do it. I pulled out my phone, dialing Jillian. "I need you here. They've hit the irrigation system. Someone's sabotaging my farm." Jillian answered immediately. "What do you mean sabotage? Are you sure it wasn't just a malfunction?" "There's nothing malfunctioning here. Pipes are cut. The water's been drained. This was deliberate. They're trying to destroy me." There was a pause on the line before Jillian spoke again, her voice as calm as ever. I'm on my way. Call the sheriff, report it as criminal damage, and we'll get the evidence. If it's who I think it is, we'll make them pay. I hung up, my hands shaking as I surveyed the damage. This wasn't just vandalism, it was a calculated attempt to ruin the vineyard's livelihood. The irrigation system was vital to the operation. Without water, the vines would wither within days. And with harvest season just around the corner, this was a blow I couldn't afford. I called the sheriff's office and reported the damage. Deputy Warren, the same one who'd been involved in the earlier investigation, arrived within the hour. He looked around at the mess and whistled low under his breath. This is bad, he said. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. These pipes weren't just broken, they were cut. And they drained your system, probably from the main line too. I need this fixed, I said, my voice tight with frustration. Do you have any idea who could have done this? Warren paused, looking out toward the darkened hills where my vineyard sat. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but given everything that's been going on with the HOA, it's a strong possibility. They've got everything to gain by forcing you off this land, and this looks like the kind of move they'd pull. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my anger in check. I'll be damned if I let them get away with this. The sheriff made some calls and promised to launch an investigation. Meanwhile, I took photos of the damage, every broken pipe, every shredded filter. By the time Jillian arrived, we had a solid case for criminal vandalism. She looked at the destruction with a grim expression. I knew they wouldn't stop. But this is next level. I nodded, pacing the pump house. I'm not going down without a fight. This is war now. Jillian reached into her bag, pulling out a file of documents. Well, they've certainly given us enough ammunition. I'll get the legal side moving. But we'll need to push the county to act fast. This is now a full-scale attack. And I was ready to strike back. This vineyard was more than just my dream. It was my home, my future. And if the HOA thought they could tear it apart with a few broken pipes and fake maps, they were about to learn just how far I would go to protect what was mine. The battle had only just begun, but I was more determined than ever to win. The next few days blurred together in a haze of phone calls, legal papers, and frustration. The vineyard's irrigation system was temporarily patched up, but the damage had been done. The vines that had been without water for over 48 hours began to show signs of wilting, and I knew the loss would be significant. That was my first harvest slipping away, and I wasn't going to let that go without a fight. I called in a few favors, reaching out to industry contacts I'd met during my journey into the wine business. But there was only one person I trusted to truly make an impact: Maxine Rhodes, known in legal circles as the wine law warrior. She specialized in vineyard and agricultural law, handling everything from property disputes to land use issues, and had helped several farmers and vineyard owners in the region protect their businesses from powerful adversaries. I wasn't sure if she would take on a case like mine, but I had to try. I couldn't do this alone, and with everything at stake, Maxine was the best chance I had at taking down the HOA and making them pay for their sabotage. Maxine's office was in a small town about 45 minutes away from the vineyard, but she agreed to meet me there. When I walked into her office, I immediately felt the weight of her reputation. Her walls were lined with framed pictures of vineyards, and a huge bookshelf was filled with legal tomes, old wine guides, and case files. Maxine herself was a no-nonsense, sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s, wearing a blazer over a simple black t-shirt. She looked up from the stack of papers on her desk, offering a firm handshake. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice steady but warm. "I've heard about your situation. I'll be honest, it sounds like a tough one, but nothing I haven't dealt with before." I took a deep breath and set the folder containing all the documentation in front of her. The deed, the fake annexation map, the photos of the irrigation damage, and the sheriff's report. I didn't just invest my life savings into this place to let them destroy it. They've crossed the line, and I want to fight back. I need your help. Maxine nodded as she flipped through the papers, taking in every detail. She paused when she got to the photos of the damaged irrigation system, her expression hardening. This is a textbook example of agricultural sabotage. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. And it wasn't just a random act of vandalism, it was an intentional attack meant to ruin your crops and your livelihood. Exactly, I said, leaning forward. And now the HOA is claiming they have the right to force me into their association. They want me to join, pay fines, and comply with rules I never agreed to in the first place. If I don't, they're threatening to tear down my vines. I can't let them get away with this. Maxine looked at me for a long moment, then gave a small, approving nod. This is personal for you, and I can see you're determined to protect your vineyard. That's good. We'll need that fire. But this is going to be a fight. The HOA isn't going to back down easily. She paused, pulling out a legal pad and jotting down notes. I'll draft a formal lawsuit for property interference, fraud, and agricultural sabotage. We're going to hit them hard on all fronts. And if it turns out this map is a forgery, that's criminal. We'll add that to the charge list. She stood and walked to a corkboard on the wall, pulling down a set of legal guidelines for vineyard disputes. We'll also look at zoning laws and land use codes. They've definitely overstepped their bounds by claiming jurisdiction over your land without legal grounds. We'll make it clear that your property is yours, and their fake annexation doesn't mean a thing. We'll take them to court if necessary, but we'll also use public pressure. Once we start shining a light on what they've done, people will start to pay attention. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maxine wasn't just a lawyer, she was a warrior. She wasn't going to back down either. No, she said, snapping her fingers. Before we do anything, I need to talk to the county's zoning board and start pulling up their records on this supposed expansion. If there's a chance they've done this before, we need to know. Later that evening, Julian and I met up at the vineyard to strategize. Maxine had already made calls to several officials, setting up meetings to get more information about the HOA's shady annexation tactics. As Julian and I went over the legal strategy, Maxine's words rang clear in my mind: public pressure. The media had already covered part of the story, but now it was time to build momentum, to show the community that this wasn't just about me. It was about stopping a corporate bully from running a small business. Jillian was already on the phone with a few local farmers and business owners, rallying support. We're going to need more than just a legal fight, she said, her voice resolute. We're going to need a movement. And so, we started planning. We'd gather the community, get the local press involved, and make sure the HOA couldn't escape their shady dealings. The fight had just begun, and now, with Maxine in our corner, we were ready to bring the full weight of the law and public opinion down on them. It wasn't just my vineyard anymore. It was a stand for every small business, every property owner, who had ever been forced to bend to the will of a powerful entity. Ruby Hill Vineyard wasn't just my dream, it was about showing everyone that standing up to bullies could actually work. The next morning, the pressure was already mounting. As I worked through the damage from the previous day, patching up irrigation lines and checking on the vines, something strange happened. The low hum of a drone buzzed overhead. I looked up, shielding my eyes from the bright morning sun. The drone hovered, then dipped lower, its camera trained directly on the crush pad, the area where I'd been processing the first batch of grapes for my debut wine. I instinctively reached for my phone, snapped a picture of the drone's flight path, and checked the time, 8:47 a.m. It was a typical overcast morning, not too windy, and everything was calm, except for this drone, circling overhead. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine, but the drone didn't stop. It continued to fly back and forth, its lens zooming in on the pad, the newly built tanks, and even the small storage barn where I kept the barrels. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed my binoculars from the porch and focused on the drone. The branding was faint, but I could make out a small logo on the side: Coastal Property Services. Coastal Property Services? I thought, my blood running cold. That name again. That was the same subcontractor responsible for the HOA's maintenance and land survey work. The same one who had been harassing my property. Were they spying on me again? Before I could call Jillian or Maxine, I saw movement from the other side of the vineyard. A black SUV slowly crept along the outer boundary of the property, its windows tinted dark. My heart skipped. I quickly ducked behind the barn, staying out of sight, but keeping my eyes on the vehicle. It stopped near the fence line, and from my vantage point, I could see a man step out, wearing the same polo shirt I'd seen before, the one with the Coastal Property Services logo. He walked up to the fence, adjusted his sunglasses, and began examining the vineyard. My blood boiled. He was trespassing, plain and simple. I waited until he turned and walked back to the SUV, where the drone operator, a young man, likely the same one flying the drone over my crush pad, jumped out and handed him a clipboard. It seemed they were making notes of everything. Were they planning another attempt at claiming my land? As soon as the SUV pulled away, I pulled my phone out, snapped photos of the vehicle and the drone, and sent them straight to Jillian and Maxine. I didn't wait for a reply. I knew what I had to do next. Later that afternoon, Maxine was back at the vineyard, running through a list of next steps with Jillian and me. I showed her the photos of the drone, the SUV, and the man from Coastal Property Services. She took one look at the images and shook her head in disbelief. "This is getting ridiculous," she said, a fire in her eyes. "They're trying to intimidate you. But what they don't realize is that this kind of surveillance is illegal. Spying on private property without consent is an invasion of privacy. We've got grounds for a cease and desist order, again." Jillian chimed in. "We've already got a pattern here. First, the threats, then the fake annexation map, the sabotage of the irrigation system, and now they're spying on you. They're pushing for something. We need to stop them now before they escalate again." Maxine agreed. "I'll draft a formal letter of complaint to both the HOA and Coastal Property Services, requesting an immediate cease of their surveillance operations. We'll also be filing an official complaint to the county zoning board. But we're not just going to sit here and wait for them to try something else. We're going to take this to the media again." The next day, Maxine made a series of calls to the local press, and before I knew it, Mara Ortiz from KLY Channel 7 was back at the vineyard, camera crew in tow, ready to cover the latest development. "Drone over the vineyard, spying on private property," Mara reported as the camera rolled. "In an ongoing battle between Ruby Hill Vineyard and the local HOA, the vineyard owner, Ryan Hayes, claims his property is under constant surveillance by HOA affiliates, this time through the use of an unmarked drone." I stood next to her, trying to keep my composure as I explained how the surveillance was just the latest in a series of illegal actions by the HOA and their associates. "They've tried to claim my property, destroy my livelihood, and now they're spying on me. This is harassment, and I won't stand for it." By the time the segment aired that evening, the story was all over social media. People were outraged, not just about the drone, but about everything the HOA had tried to do. My phone exploded with texts and messages of support from local farmers, business owners, and even concerned citizens. The HOA had underestimated the power of public opinion. They thought they could bully me into submission, but they were about to learn the hard way that the people of this town wouldn't stand for this kind of behavior. With Maxine on my side, Jillian's legal expertise, and the community backing us up, the tide was turning. The HOA had underestimated not just me, but the entire town, and soon they'd have to face the consequences. The fight was far from over, but we were winning the battle of public opinion. Now it was time to make sure they didn't get away with it. The next few days felt like a waiting game. The media coverage kept growing, more articles, more outraged posts on social media, and a growing number of supporters rallying behind me. The HOA had backed off from any direct confrontation, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they made their next move. They didn't want to be seen as the bad guys, especially not after all the negative press. But that didn't mean they were done with their campaign to force me off my property. And sure enough, they weren't done. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when everything changed. The vineyard was calm, the air thick with the smell of fresh earth, and I had just wrapped up a long day of tending to the vines. I was in the back of the house, taking a much-needed break when I heard the sound of Buck, my dog, barking wildly from the porch. I jumped up, instinctively reaching for the rifle I kept near the door. Buck's barking grew frantic, almost panicked, and I immediately knew something was wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, heart pounding in my chest. It was already dark, and the vineyard, bathed in the moonlight, felt eerie and quiet, too quiet. Buck was pacing back and forth near the trellis area at the edge of the vineyard, barking at something near the fence. I ran toward him, scanning the rows of vines. That's when I saw it, a faint mist in the air near the plants, like a thin fog hanging just above the ground. My stomach dropped as the smell hit me. It was chemical. Acrid. Something was being sprayed. I didn't waste another second. I ran straight to the source, the area where the mist seemed to be concentrated, and my blood turned cold. The vines in the area were wilting, the leaves curling and blackening in places, while the mist still lingered in the air, clinging to the earth like a toxic fog. Someone had sprayed herbicide, the very chemical I'd been fighting to keep out of the vineyard. I stumbled back in shock, my heart racing. This wasn't an accident. Someone had intentionally poisoned my vines, just like they had with the irrigation system. It was clear now, this wasn't just a land grab. They were trying to destroy everything I had built. I pulled out my phone and immediately called Jillian. "It's happening again," I said, my voice trembling. "They've sprayed herbicide, poisoned my vines. It's all over the eastern row of the vineyard." Jillian didn't hesitate. "Call the sheriff, report it as a criminal act. I'll be there in an hour." I dialed the sheriff's office, reporting the incident as quickly as I could, and by the time Deputy Warren arrived, I was standing in the same spot, trying to keep my composure as I surveyed the damage. The sheriff walked the perimeter with me, his face grim as he looked at the blackened vines. "This isn't random," Warren said, inspecting the area. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing. This is professional-grade herbicide. It's meant to kill crops fast. Someone targeted you." I nodded, barely able to speak. The weight of it was crushing. This was the point where they'd crossed the line. They weren't just trying to bully me anymore. They were trying to destroy everything I had worked for. Warren took down the details, then turned to me. "We'll launch an investigation. But I'll tell you now, this goes beyond a simple property dispute. They're trying to wreck your business. We'll treat this as vandalism, and we'll do everything we can to catch the person responsible." The next morning, I stood among the damaged vines, staring at the destruction. The crop loss was staggering. In just a few hours, a section of the vineyard had been ruined, thousands of dollars in potential revenue wiped out. I couldn't just stand there. I had to do something. This wasn't just about fighting back anymore, it was about survival. Jillian arrived soon after, carrying a folder with legal documents. She walked up to me, eyes narrowed. "This is criminal now. I've talked to some of the other landowners, and they're saying this has happened before. The HOAs had their fingers in other people's crops and properties. This has gone way past extortion, it's sabotage. We need to go public with this," I said, my voice tight. "If they think they can get away with poisoning my vines, they're mistaken. They've made a mistake." Jillian nodded. "I'll draft a public statement and work with Mara to get the story out. We'll put pressure on the county, show them that this isn't just about you, it's about everyone who's being bullied by this HOA." That afternoon, the story hit the local news again. The headline read, "HOA under fire after vineyard owner claims herbicide sabotage in latest attack." The media coverage was immediate and widespread. Mara's report, paired with video footage from my security cameras showing the moment the herbicide was sprayed, helped paint a picture of deliberate destruction. The local community rallied behind me, condemning the HOA for their blatant tactics. The fallout from the herbicide attack was swift. The story, amplified by the local news outlets, sparked outrage not just in my town but in the surrounding areas as well. The attack on Ruby Hill Vineyard became a symbol of the HOA's blatant overreach and bullying tactics, and it wasn't long before the community started to fight back, not just for me, but for anyone who had ever been bullied into submission by powerful organizations. By the time the weekend arrived, things were already starting to change. What had been an isolated battle for my vineyard had turned into a full-fledged movement. The hashtag #SaveRubyHillVineyard hashtag was trending on social media, and I was receiving messages of support from all corners: farmers, local businesses, and even environmental groups who had been following the story. They were angry. They were willing to help. And they weren't going to let the HOA get away with this. Saturday morning came with a crisp breeze and a sense of purpose in the air. The Vintners Alliance, a local network of small vineyards and farms, had sent out an open invitation to anyone who wanted to help. What started as a quiet email chain between a few of the vineyard owners quickly snowballed into a full-on rally. By noon, the parking lot at Ruby Hill Vineyard was packed with pickup trucks, SUVs, and even a few vintage cars from the old vineyards down the road. People were pouring in: local farmers, winemakers, workers from nearby businesses, and even a few passionate residents who had never been involved in agriculture before. Some were there to help with the physical labor, replanting vines, repairing the irrigation system, and restringing the trellises that had been damaged. Others were there to offer legal advice, contribute financially, or simply show their support. It was overwhelming, and incredibly humbling. The first person to arrive was David Thompson, a seasoned winemaker from Willow Creek Vineyards, who had heard about the sabotage on the news and decided to offer his help. He had a keen eye for the quality of grapes and quickly started assessing the damage to the vines. "You've got some salvageable clusters here," he said, running his hand through the vines. "But it's going to take time to get these back to full production. We'll help you out, but you'll need to be patient." Sarah Adams, a local environmental lawyer who had been following the HOA's antics, also showed up with a binder full of legal documents. "I've been dealing with HOAs for years," she said, smiling as she handed me the binder. "This is my fight, too. I'll help you with filing the complaints and work with Jillian on the next steps. We'll get them on legal grounds." Other locals, including a few farmers I'd met at local markets, had brought tractors, tools, and buckets of supplies to fix the irrigation system. John Miller, who owned a dairy farm just down the road, drove his tractor straight to the vineyard, shouting, "Let's fix these pipes." I watched in awe as everyone pitched in. The workers were efficient, moving with purpose, helping me get my vineyard back on track. The sense of community was palpable. It wasn't just about my vineyard anymore, it was about sending a message. And we were all working together to make that message loud and clear: no one messes with a farmer's land. By the afternoon, the work was already visible. The irrigation system was almost fully restored, and the vines that had suffered the most from the herbicide were being carefully tended to. The mood was optimistic, but we all knew the real work had only just begun. Mara Ortiz showed up mid-afternoon with a camera crew, documenting the entire scene. She filmed workers replanting vines, farmers explaining how they were helping, and the volunteers talking about how the HOA's actions had pushed them to stand up for what was right. Her cameras didn't stop rolling. This wasn't just about Ruby Hill Vineyard anymore. It was a community coming together to push back against a force that had tried to tear us apart. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the vineyard, I stood on the porch with Jillian and Maxine, taking in the sight of people working together. It was bittersweet, knowing that the vineyard would never be the same again, but seeing the support made it all feel worth it. Jillian looked over at me and smiled. "You know, I didn't expect this much help. It's incredible." Maxine nodded. "The community's rallying behind you. And the HOA? They're running out of options." I exhaled, feeling the weight of the last few weeks lift slightly. "They won't stop. But now either will we." Jillian gave a small, determined laugh. "No, now it's a matter of making them regret every move they've made." By the time the rally wrapped up, I felt like I wasn't just fighting for my vineyard anymore. I was fighting for every person who had ever felt powerless against a corporation, or a bully. And as the evening faded, I realized something. This was no longer about just protecting Ruby Hill Vineyard. This was about taking a stand for something much larger than that. The battle had already shifted. The community had rallied around me, and I wasn't alone anymore. Together, we were going to take this fight all the way, and we were going to win. The HOA didn't stand a chance. It wasn't long before the situation reached a tipping point. The HOA, feeling the heat from the media and the community's overwhelming support for Ruby Hill Vineyard, had no choice but to respond. But instead of backing down, they went on the offensive. The following week, I received a formal notice from the county zoning board. The HOA was filing a request to formally annex my property into the Emerald Crest Estate's boundaries. This was the move I had been expecting. They were trying to legitimize their claim to my land by taking it to the zoning board. They knew that if they succeeded in getting the zoning board to approve their request, it would give them legal grounds to enforce their rules and fines. The zoning board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. The tension in the air was palpable. Jillian, Maxine, and I spent the days leading up to it preparing, pulling together evidence and organizing our legal arguments. We weren't just fighting a territorial claim, we were fighting for the very principle of land rights and the future of small, independent businesses like mine. By Thursday afternoon, the room was packed. Neighbors, local farmers, winemakers, and community members had shown up to support me. They filled the seats, the aisles, and stood along the back wall. It felt like a community rally in the heart of government. They were there to show that this wasn't just about a vineyard, it was about standing up against the injustice of corporate bullies. As we entered the zoning board chamber, I could already feel the pressure mounting. The HOA delegation was seated on the other side, all wearing suits and acting like they owned the room. Their lawyers were prepared. Gregory Holt was there, smug as ever, but his face was tight with nervous energy. He knew this wouldn't be easy. The hearing began with the usual formalities, but the moment the zoning board chairman called for the HOA's spokesperson to present their case, the room grew eerily silent. Gregory Holt stood up, adjusted his tie, and began speaking in a smooth, practiced tone. Members of the zoning board, Holt started. The expansion of Emerald Crest Estates is a natural and necessary step to ensure the continued growth of our community. We have carefully evaluated the surrounding land, and it's clear that Ruby Hill Vineyard, which sits at the edge of the estate, would benefit from being included in our jurisdiction. The vineyard currently sits within the expansion zone, and this annexation would allow for the necessary regulations to be enforced, ensuring that our community remains cohesive and orderly. I clenched my fists. His words were polished, but I could see the cracks. He was putting up a facade, and the cracks were beginning to show. This wasn't about community or growth. It was about control and power. When Hope finished, the chairman turned to me and Jillian. Mr. Hayes, would you like to present your side? Jillian stood first, with Maxine beside her. Yes, thank you, Jillian said, her voice calm but firm. We believe the HOA's claim is both legally and ethically unfounded. Mr. Hayes' property, Ruby Hill Vineyard, is not part of Emerald Crest Estates, and no valid annexation has occurred. The map they've presented, which supposedly shows Ruby Hill within their jurisdiction, has no official county certification and is completely fraudulent. In addition, we have records showing that the HOA's representatives have engaged in coercive practices, including intimidation and sabotage, to force Mr. Hayes into compliance. Jillian laid out the facts: the fraudulent annexation map, the illegal drone surveillance, the herbicide attack, and the sabotage of my irrigation system. She showed the zoning board the evidence we had gathered, photos of the damaged vines, the herbicide that had been sprayed, and the official police reports confirming criminal activity. The room was quiet as Jillian spoke, and for the first time, the HOA representatives began to look uneasy. Then, Maxine took the floor. Her presence was commanding. She was used to courtrooms, and the zoning board was no different. We're not here just to ask the board to reject this annexation proposal, Maxine said, her voice clear and unwavering. We're here to demand justice. The HOA is using illegal tactics to claim control over someone's private property, and their actions should not be allowed to stand. What they are doing is extortion, plain and simple. If this annexation is approved, it sets a dangerous precedent for every landowner in this county. No one will be safe from the unchecked power of corporate HOAs, and that will affect the very fabric of this community." Her words landed like a hammer. I could see the zoning board members, 5 in total, lean forward in their seats, their expressions turning from passive to attentive. The gravity of the situation was setting in. After what felt like an eternity of back and forth, Gregory Holt stood up again, but this time he was on the defensive. He tried to spin the story, claiming that Ruby Hill Vineyard was in need of oversight, that it wasn't being properly maintained, and that annexing the land would ensure it stayed up to community standards. But it was clear the board wasn't buying it. After a few minutes of deliberation, the chairman finally spoke, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "We've heard enough. The zoning board will adjourn for a brief recess to consider the evidence." We sat in stunned silence as the board members filed out, leaving us with the weight of the moment. My vineyard was hanging in the balance, but something had shifted. We had the upper hand now. After what felt like an eternity, the zoning board returned, and the chairman spoke again. "We have reviewed the materials presented today, and after careful consideration, the zoning board has unanimously decided to reject the annexation proposal. We find that the annexation map presented by the HOA is not valid and that the HOA's actions have been coercive and unlawful. Ruby Hill Vineyard remains independent and will not be annexed into Emerald Crest Estates. Furthermore, we are referring the HOA's actions to the district attorney for further investigation." The room erupted into applause. I stood there, stunned for a moment, as the weight of the decision hit me. We had won. The HOA's hold over my land was officially broken. But as I turned to face Jillian and Maxine, I knew this wasn't the end of the battle. The HOA would come at us again. They were cornered now, and cornered animals fought the hardest. But for now, the vineyard was mine, and I would defend it with everything I had. The fight wasn't over, but we had just won the most important battle. And with the community behind me, I was more confident than ever that we would win the war. It was hard to believe the zoning board's decision had only come down a few weeks ago. The battle had taken so much out of me, mentally, emotionally, and financially, that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to simply enjoy the fruits of my labor. But now, the vineyard had a new life again. Ruby Hill Vineyard wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And we had a harvest festival to prove it. We had worked tirelessly to get the vines back in shape. The sabotage had set us back, but with the help of the community, local farmers, and the Vintners Alliance, we had pulled through. The first batch of wine from the rejuvenated vineyard, my very first vintage, was ready to be shared. Harvest Day arrived with a clear sky and a crisp breeze, perfect for what we had planned. Local vendors, food trucks, and musicians had set up near the vineyard's entrance. The mood was light, the air filled with laughter and the warm, earthy smell of grape must. It wasn't just about wine, it was about celebration. A celebration of survival, of community, of defiance. I stood at the edge of the vineyard, looking over the rows of vines. The grapes, though still young, were ripe with promise. Some were plump and bursting with juice, while others were still maturing, ready to be harvested next season. There were 3 full barrels ready to be aged, the first wine I had ever produced under the Ruby Hill label. People gathered under the shade of a large tent, where a local chef was preparing dishes that paired perfectly with the wines. John Miller, the dairy farmer who had helped me fix the irrigation, was serving cheeses from his farm. It felt like the whole town had shown up to support me, and as I walked around, shaking hands, thanking people for their help, I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the sense of belonging. This wasn't just my vineyard anymore, it was ours. Then, the moment arrived. The first official tasting of Ruby Hill's first vintage. I stood at the front of the crowd, holding up a glass of deep, ruby red wine. To everyone who stood by me, to every farmer, every neighbor, and every friend, I began, my voice shaky with emotion. This is more than just a wine, it's a testament to the power of community. It's a celebration of what happens when we stand together, when we refuse to be intimidated or bullied. This wine is ours, not just mine. The crowd cheered, raising their glasses. The tension of the past few months, the sabotage, the legal battles, the fear that my dream might be lost forever, melted away in that moment. The wine was surprisingly good, considering the challenges we'd faced. It wasn't perfect, but it had the kind of flavor that only comes from hard work and perseverance. A bit rough around the edges, but strong and full of character. The crowd agreed, offering compliments and asking when they could buy a bottle. As the sun set and the first harvest festival came to a close, I stood with Maxine and Jillian, who had stayed with me through every step of the journey. "We did it," I said, clinking glasses with them. Maxine grinned. "No, you did it. We just helped you get out of your own way." Jillian nodded, her eyes proud. "And now, it's time for the world to taste what Ruby Hill can do. You're not just a vineyard owner anymore. You're a symbol of what happens when you fight back against the bullies." I felt a smile tug at the corner of my lips. "I'll drink to that." As the festival wound down, I stayed at the vineyard long after everyone else had left, sitting on the porch with a glass of wine, watching the last of the sun dip behind the hills. My vineyard, my dream, had survived. But the reality of the fight was still with me. The HOA might have been legally beaten, but they hadn't given up. They were like a shadow, lingering at the edges of my life, and I knew they'd be back. That night, as I sat in silence, a new envelope arrived, slipped under the door. I opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, written in bold, anonymous handwriting. "You may have won the first battle, but this war isn't over. We know your vines depend on the aquifer. We can stop that. Remember, water is power." My blood ran cold. They were threatening my water supply. I folded the letter slowly and set it down on the table. The battle was far from over. But as I stared out at the vineyard, I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. Ruby Hill Vineyard wasn't just about wine anymore. It was about the fight for what was right, the fight to preserve my land. And the HOA was going to have to learn that they'd picked the wrong opponent. This time, I would be ready for them. The days following the festival were filled with bittersweet triumph. While the success of the Ruby Hill Vineyard Harvest Festival was a much-needed victory, the threat in that anonymous letter kept gnawing at the back of my mind. Water is power. I couldn't ignore it. The HOA wasn't just going to stop after their failed annexation and sabotage. They were coming at me from a new angle, one that could destroy everything I had left. The vineyard's water came from the Willow Creek Aquifer, a shared resource that had been used by farmers in the area for generations. It wasn't regulated by the county, at least, not in any formal capacity, and every farm, including mine, had a well tapping into it. As far as I was concerned, it was my water, part of my property rights. But the letter's warning had made me realize something important. If the HOA could control access to the water, they could choke me out faster than anything else. I spent the following days preparing for what was coming. The weather had shifted, and the fall rains had started, bringing much-needed relief to the soil. But the water I used to keep my vineyard alive had never felt more precious. Maxine came back to the vineyard a week later, bringing with her a local water rights expert, Tom Miller, a man who had been involved in water disputes for decades. He had a weathered face and deep lines from years spent working the land, but his knowledge of the Willow Creek Aquifer was unparalleled. We met at the pump house, where the water for the irrigation system flowed in. Tom examined the setup, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Your well is strong, Mr. Hayes," he said, looking up at me. "But if they want to hit you, they'll try to cut off your legal claim to the aquifer." I nodded, already knowing the direction he was going. "What can we do to protect it?" Tom rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "You need to get your water rights officially registered with the county. Right now, there's nothing concrete tying your well to the aquifer in the eyes of the law. That's something the HOA could exploit, especially if they've been gathering support from other landowners who want a piece of that water for their own developments." Maxine leaned in, adding, "The HOA has a lot of sway, especially if they can pressure the county into denying water rights to someone else. We've seen it happen before in other counties, big corporations buying up water rights and shutting down the small guy." My stomach twisted. The thought of losing my lifeblood, the water my vines needed to survive, was a terrifying possibility. Without it, Ruby Hill Vineyard wouldn't last the winter. "Is there a way to lock in the rights to the aquifer?" I asked, trying to remain calm. "First things first," Tom said, walking over to the water pump system. "We'll need to prove the well's been in use for years. That means we'll need proof of historical use, farm records, water usage logs, maybe even neighbors who've seen you drawing from it. Then we can file a water rights claim with the county. That will make it official." I breathed a sigh of relief. This was something tangible I could fight for. If I could get official documentation of my use of the aquifer, the HOA wouldn't be able to take that away. It was time to stop reacting and start taking control of my future. Jillian went to work on the legal paperwork, while Maxine helped me gather the necessary historical evidence. I reached out to the neighbors who had been farming in the area longer than I had, asking them about their knowledge of the aquifer. Most were more than willing to back me up, especially after hearing about the HOA's tactics. We compiled old irrigation records, usage logs, and even personal testimonies to prove the long-standing connection between the vineyard and the water source. 2 weeks later, Jillian and I stood before the County Water Rights Board, an official body tasked with overseeing water usage and distribution in the region. The room was filled with farmers, developers, and other landowners who had a stake in the outcome. When it was finally my turn, I stepped up to the podium, feeling the weight of the situation. "I'm here today to claim water rights to the Willow Creek aquifer," I began, my voice steady. "I've owned Ruby Hill Vineyard for 2 years, but this isn't just about one piece of land. It's about protecting the water that has sustained generations of farmers in this region." I handed over the stacks of evidence we had compiled, starting with the historical usage records showing how long the well had been in use. I explained the importance of the aquifer to my vineyard, how it was tied to my success, and how the HOA had attempted to threaten my access to it by using fraudulent annexation claims. The board members listened attentively, and after a few questions from the zoning commissioners about the specifics of my well, they adjourned the meeting for deliberation. The tension in the room was thick. 30 minutes later, the board reconvened and the chairman spoke up. "We have reviewed the evidence, and we find that Mr. Hayes has a legitimate claim to the Willow Creek aquifer. His historical use of the water, coupled with the testimonies provided, affirms that Ruby Hill Vineyard has a right to draw from the aquifer, and the claim made by the HOA is invalid." The room broke into murmurs, and I felt a wave of relief flood over me. "We also recommend that the HOA cease any further attempts to claim water rights to the aquifer that were not filed officially and will be monitored for future developments." The chairman continued. "This will be enforced." It was official. The HOA could no longer touch my water. The vineyard's survival was secured. That night, I sat on the porch again, watching the stars as the vineyard settled into its peaceful rhythm. The sound of crickets filled the air. Ruby Hill Vineyard was still mine. And the HOA? They had just learned the hard way that I wasn't going anywhere. But I knew this wasn't the end. The HOA was down, but they weren't out. And if they came after me again, I was ready for them. Ruby Hill had survived. And with community support, and the law now firmly on my side, I knew they would never take it from me. The tension of the past few months had finally begun to settle, but the feeling of victory was still electric in the air. With the water rights secured and the HOA's attempts to wrest control over Ruby Hill Vineyard thwarted, it was time to celebrate. It felt like the whole town was ready to kick back and finally enjoy the fruits of our collective labor. The harvest season had been a tough one, but we made it through, and there was a new sense of camaraderie among the community. Ruby Hill Vineyard wasn't just my victory anymore, it was our victory. The night before the festival, Jillian called me, her voice crackling with excitement. "Ryan, the party's set for tomorrow, right? Because you've earned this one. The entire town's showing up, locals, farmers, wine producers from all over." "I'm just waiting for the first toast," I replied, standing on the porch of the vineyard. The setting sun bathed the land in that beautiful golden glow I had dreamed of, the rows of vines now swaying gently in the evening breeze. The sight still took my breath away. The next morning, the vineyard grounds were transformed into an oasis of celebration. Long tables draped in white linen were set up beneath rows of stringed lights, bottles of wine were uncorked, and local chefs were grilling meats and preparing fresh dishes. There were kids running around, wine-tasting booths set up, and even a few local musicians strumming guitars and fiddles under the oak trees. The people were here, not just for the wine, but for the sense of community we had all built together. The moment felt full circle. My dream had been under siege, but it had brought us all together in ways I hadn't imagined. Maxine stood with me as the first guests started to arrive. She was wearing a smile that matched my own. "You've come a long way, Ryan," she said, sipping from a glass of wine. "What you've built here is incredible. Everyone is talking about how much they admire your fight. And honestly, it's not just about the wine, it's about the principle. You took on the system, and you won." I nodded, staring at the crowd that had gathered. "Yeah, we did. And none of this would have happened if it weren't for everyone showing up and standing with me." Maxine raised her glass. "To Ruby Hill. To you. To community." I clinked my glass against hers, feeling the weight of the journey lift as I took a sip of the wine that had survived it all. Ruby Hill's first vintage had its share of flaws. It wasn't perfect. But the taste? Rich, complex, with a deep, lingering finish. It felt like the vineyard itself, full of life, full of struggle, but unbroken. As the night went on, the festivities escalated, with music and laughter ringing through the vineyard. People took turns offering their toasts, from local farmers to those who had never set foot on a farm but had shown up in support. One of the winemakers from a neighboring vineyard, David Thompson, stepped up to the microphone, his glass raised high. "This vineyard here, Ruby Hill, has become something of a legend in this region. What Ryan's done, standing up to the HOA, standing for the land, for all of us, it's inspiring. Here's to the man who brought us all together. May your vines always grow strong, and may your battles always be worth fighting." The crowd cheered. My chest tightened as I stood there, surrounded by friends, old and new, my vines flourishing under the warm glow of the festival lights. I could hardly believe how far we'd come. I had almost lost everything, but here we were, on the other side of it, stronger than ever. The community had rallied behind me when I needed it most, and they'd helped me reclaim my vineyard. Ruby Hill Vineyard was finally becoming what I had always hoped it would be, a place of family, passion, and resilience. Later in the evening, as the stars filled the sky, I walked away from the crowd to the edge of the vineyard, where the land stretched out in front of me like a vast canvas. Buck trotted beside me, tail wagging happily as we moved through the rows of vines that had brought me to this moment. I took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill my lungs. The vineyard had survived the worst of the storm. But I knew that the fight wasn't truly over yet. The HOA had been forced to retreat, but I had no illusion that they wouldn't try again. No one who'd seen the money they were eyeing would back down easily. But for now, the land was mine. And I had my community. Together, we had defied the odds. "I think we made it, boy," I said to Buck, watching the peaceful fields stretch out before me. He barked, as if to agree, and I smiled, knowing that we had not just fought for land or for a dream, but for the freedom to live life on our terms. And with that freedom, Ruby Hill Vineyard would continue to grow, not just as a vineyard, but as a symbol of what could be achieved when you refused to back down. The future was uncertain, but I was ready for whatever came next. This was just the beginning. The Harvest Festival was a success, and with the community's unwavering support, it felt like the vineyard had finally come into its own. The wine was flowing, the vines were thriving, and the future of Ruby Hill Vineyard seemed brighter than ever. But as the lights dimmed on the festival, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. That sense of relief, of victory, was quickly followed by the thought of that anonymous letter, the one about the water rights. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the truth was clear: the HOA wasn't done. The evening after the festival, as I sat on the porch, nursing a final glass of wine and watching the stars twinkle above the vineyard, the quiet was broken by a thud at the front door. I stood up, surprised. I wasn't expecting any deliveries. Hesitantly, I opened the door and found another envelope, this time heavier and more official-looking than the last. No return address. Just a simple stamped seal. I tore it open, and as soon as I read the words, my stomach sank. Ruby Hill Vineyard's access to the Willow Creek Aquifer is now under review. You are hereby notified that your water rights will be reassessed by the newly formed Willow Creek Water Authority. Further use of water from this aquifer is suspended until further notice. You are advised to cease any irrigation activities immediately. Failure to comply will result in fines and legal action. The review process will commence in the coming weeks. My hands began to shake as I read the letter over and over. The Willow Creek Aquifer, the very source that had sustained my vineyard, was being put up for reassessment. And without water, the vineyard wouldn't survive. I quickly reread the letter, my heart racing as I realized what this was, a blatant threat. This wasn't just an inconvenience or a minor setback. This was the HOA's last-ditch attempt to destroy Ruby Hill Vineyard, using the one resource that had kept it alive. If they managed to control the water rights, they could force me out. Maxine was the first person I called, my voice tense with urgency. "Maxine, they've done it again," I said, my voice shaky. "They're coming after my water rights. The HOA has managed to get the Willow Creek Aquifer under review. They want to take control of the water, and without it, I'm finished." She was silent for a moment, then responded. "This is bigger than we thought. They've shifted their focus to your water because they know you can't operate without it. This isn't just about your land anymore, it's about their ability to control everything you need to run your vineyard. Can we stop them?" I asked, my desperation growing. "I'll start researching the legal angle," she said, her voice steady. "But I need you to stay calm. We need to fight this legally, and we need to get ahead of them. Water rights are a tricky issue, but we've got one thing they don't: public opinion. If we rally the community again, show the county how far the HOA is willing to go to take your property, we have a chance." The next morning, I met with Jillian and Maxine to discuss our options. The letter had come from the newly formed Willow Creek Water Authority, a group I'd never heard of before. I had my suspicions. It seemed too convenient that this entity had just been created, right after the HOA's failed attempt to annex my land. Maxine was already on her laptop, searching for any legal filings or public records about this new water authority. "I can't find any paperwork filed with the county," she said, her brow furrowed. "No public meetings, no official registration. This is new, and that's a problem. The HOA is pulling strings behind the scenes, using this authority to get control over your water rights." I was starting to feel the weight of it all again, the feeling that the battle wasn't just about to restart, but was now reaching a boiling point. Without water, everything I had worked for would wither and die, and it felt like the HOA had played their trump card. "We need to find out who's behind this water authority," Jillian said, her eyes narrowing. "Who are they really working for? We need to get ahead of this and make sure they don't get away with it." The coming weeks were a blur of legal battles, public records requests, and strategic planning. We reached out to environmental groups, local farmers, and water rights activists, anyone who could help us expose the HOA's underhanded tactics. It became clear that the HOA had been working in the shadows to set this up, using its connections to create a legal way to control the area's water sources. Then, one evening, as I sat in my office with Jillian, the phone rang. It was Deputy Warren. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his voice heavy. "We've just intercepted a document, one that wasn't meant for public eyes. The Willow Creek Water Authority isn't just a new agency, it's a front for Emerald Crest Estate's real estate developers. They've been trying to seize control of all the water rights to this region for months, and it looks like your vineyard was the final piece they needed." My stomach dropped. The HOA wasn't just a nuisance, it was an orchestrated land grab, and now they were using the water to finish the job. As I hung up the phone, I stared at the letter again, feeling that familiar anger rise up. I had fought for Ruby Hill Vineyard once, and now I had to fight again, this time, for something far more important than land. I wasn't about to let them take my water, the very thing that had sustained everything I had built. The fight was far from over, and the stakes had just gotten higher. With Jillian and Maxine by my side, we were going to expose the truth, stop the HOA from seizing the water rights, and take this battle all the way to the top if we had to. This war had entered a new phase. And this time, I was ready for whatever came next.